perfect houses with nice lawns, suburban and endless pot roast, blueberry pies, fireworks, ice cream, sundaes, immaculate bathrooms, Memorial Day cookouts, block associations and driveways, tree houses, and Cub Scouts. So thinking about how he's defining the dream and this image, he then goes on to say that for a time in his life, he wanted to wrap himself in the blanket of this dream until he realized that the dream rests on our backs, the bedding made from our bodies. And it seems to me that that is, in part, a connection to this idea that respectability has partly been predicated on some kind of denial of Black humanity, whether in the literal lynching of Black people in the South to coerce them to live under a Jim Crow regime, or policing in Ferguson to literally fund the municipality to line the pockets of the white administration.
The subject about how much of this is planned, right? So 1971, Anthony Downs wrote that book, Opening Up the Suburbs. And what he wanted to do was explore how do we incorporate 20 to 25% people of color and or people who are poor in our utopias. How do we manage that process, right? I saw that same thing when I went to Compton and had to understand that history. And so where we moved from St. Clair Drake, talking about Horace Cayton, talking about 10 to 12% of Black residency, then competes with whites for resources, we have to really think about how much of this, sort of these projects of white hegemony and white comfort, white cultural comfortability is planned. And so what does that look like now in Evanston, where in the Black neighborhood, the white police chief has no problem admitting that we have escalated stop and frisk.
We know they can't isolate it to Ferguson. Nationally, you can't isolate it to Ferguson. Stop trying to give all these other cities, every town, Ferguson, USA, the benefits of feeling like their absence of this oppression, their absence of this structural racism and this police brutality. I think it's all in the narrative and the language that we use when we talk about these issues and who suffers from them the most, and not honing in on this as, oh, well, you know, this is Ferguson.
Or the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, even if we want to look at it from a global perspective, you know, globally, Black struggle is so interconnected. But, you know, we'll have to talk about white supremacy, and then people have to confront white supremacy for what it actually is. For a lot of folks, that's difficult. You know, last night I was at a panel discussing racism in France. They want to acknowledge the fact that there's racism, but they don't want to acknowledge the fact that there's white supremacy. You know, we have to have this larger conversation and stop isolating this down to bits and pieces of oppression.
All said, well, Black people don't like to camp. Black people don't like to go outside. So many people had the story, well, maybe my family camped, but we didn't know any other Black families that camped. Right. And so shortly after I returned from that, I went to the open house here and I saw your installation. And the first line of it writes about how until the 20th century, white and Black observers thought of Black people as a rural people. Mm-hmm. And I have to think, how do we become internalized with these ideas? With how this country was built, how could we say that Black people don't know how to be outside when we historically built this country outside, and as you show in the installation as well, literally built these suburbs and built Levittown, but then don't have access to living inside of the dream of what it is.